Hello class, my name is Mary Angel Marino and today we will be talking about affirmative action. So first we're going to start with the identification of affirmative action, then we will move to the early origins of affirmative action in Afro-Latin America and China, evolution of affirmative action, court cases leading to development in the US, impact on practice, consequences of not following affirmative action, responding to critics, and how my view on the act was transformed and significant takeaways. Let's go ahead and start with identification. Identification. Affirmative action is any measure that allocates resources, such as admission to selective universities or professional schools, jobs, promotions, public contracts, business loans, or rights to buy, sell, or use land through a process that takes into account individual membership in underrepresented groups. In the article, A Solution to Multiple Problems, The Origins of Affirmative Action in Higher Education Around the World, written by Warrico and Allen in 2019, they pointed out this definition from Sabah, which in 2011 had the journal Affirmative Action, the U.S. Experience in Comparative Perspective. In higher education, institutions must take into consideration the underrepresented students on campus and within a broader scope of society. Public and private higher education sectors in America have slowly integrated affirmative action since the 1960s, following the civil rights movement. I always think about affirmative action when I think of when I first came to America. One of my favorite movies was Dazed and Confused, and I always thought what an amazing time it would be for me to be back in that time. But then I started thinking about it more, and being a Latina woman, I don't think I would have the best time. So I always think about affirmative action in that sense. So we have come a long way, but we still need a long way to go. While many institutions have adopted practices to enact affirmative action, not all have followed suit. It is imperative to point out that institutions that have adopted affirmative action models vary. There have been some states that have passed statewide bans on affirmative action in all universities and colleges that receive state funding. Changes in political climate, demographic changes, and uncertainty affect how affirmative action is sustained or reformed. I'd like to point out the first slide here that discusses or shows how political climate can change. Here in America, we have had a lot of changes within our political climate, and it doesn't just happen in America. It happens all the time in South America, and it happens as well as in India, where they have many different types of parties. The important thing to point out is this new thought process of neoliberalism. A lot of the changes that are happening in America remind me of the changes that happened back in my country. So it is very crucial that we come together, not divided, and have these tough conversations so we can come to some kind of consensus and bipartisanship to get things done. I would also like to point out the demographic transition. When there is a lot of periods of heavy unrest or cartel violence, a lot of people, or something happens with their climate, like their actual weather, a lot of people are displaced and they come and seek new places to live. If we do not take better care of our global community, we will have more and more demographic transition. Now we can move on to the early origins of affirmative action, one of my favorite parts that I learned about. Due to large numbers of African and Asian nations gaining their independence from colonists during the mid-20th century, unbalanced levels of prosperity and stability emerge across various margins, including social, religious, and ethnic. Davis and Kaluniwu in 2001 explained that in Africa, in particular, the colonial legacy of patently artificial borders drawn for the convenience of European conference tables bequeathed to many newly independent African nations a motley mix of people, each with their separate ethnic loyalties and traditions. The process of nation building pursues to unite a people under a government and to create among them a stable cultural, economic, political, and social community. For a collective nation to emerge, leaders of post-colonialism set in motion in various progressive programs, one being affirmative action. In India and Malaysia, affirmative action policies arose to protect the majority who became marginalized and socially deprived under the rule of colonization. China's acquisition of a national admission system brought about affirmative action policies that included extra points on the National College Entrance Exam, the NCEE, and lowered caps on scores for admissions for ethnic minorities, distinctly those living in rural, frontier, and mountainous regions. I retrieved this source from Wang T. Preferential Policies for Minority College Admissions on China, Recent Developments, Necessity and Impact. Affirmative Action in China and the U.S. is a dialogue of inequality and minority education. Group-based mobilization and anti-racism happen when there are high levels of inequality within an identity group, such as slavery and acute injustice. Out of this imbalance, affirmative action is propelled by those most affected who fight for the idea of national group consciousness, and these movements engage in multinational dialogue about non-discrimination. Romania and Brazil are amongst the most recent adopters of mandatory affirmative action policies. Voluntary affirmative programs occur rather than state-mandated systems under the conditions of inequality, the avoidance of discrimination, and racialism. I'd like to point out a little bit of my personal knowledge that I know about Brazil. Brazil is one of the BRIC countries coming up in economy. At what cost, though? There has been a lot of inequality and unrest from the current government. So much so that they were unable to get COVID under control and they had a really hard time, just like us. There are certain things, and I have to point this out because it's important for everyone to know that while the economy might be boosting, it's at the cost of the lower class. Long and Kabazanjian, 2012, explained that former slave populations in Romania, Roma, and the United States, African Americans, as well as Brazil, Black Brazilians, continue to experience various forms of social exclusion, and racial inequality exists in each context. This explains why Afro-Brazilians are 2.5 times more likely to be illiterate than white Brazilians, considerably less likely to attend college, and earn half as much as their white counterparts. But as you can see on the picture on the left, they are a fighting spirit. They are the reason why these changes have been made. So I do applaud them for doing that, because you might be not given the chances and might be a little bit more illiterate than your white counterparts. But if you have integrity and soul and like social justice deep within your soul, you know, and some street smarts, I think you can get by. This is relevant in other South American countries as well as Central American countries, which I consider North American countries because it's in North America. You can see on the graph that there are people of all colors in Latin American countries. As you will be able to tell on the graph, some countries have more Caucasians than other. In Venezuela, there's definitely more African background. And this is because back in the independence wars, a lot of African and indigenous people were killed in battle. So having lived in Venezuela before the Chavez Revolution, I witnessed firsthand the discrepancy in the quality of education the majority received. We used to go to a private school, and the children from public schools would go and throw rocks at our school whenever the public teachers would go on strike due to reductions in budgets and inequality. That was one of the first experiences I had in learning about injustice. When countries don't take these periods of inequality seriously, revolutions are born. After they would throw rocks, the police would come and throw tear gas, and I would remember my brother would come from his classroom with a rag of alcohol to put over my face so I didn't get sick from the tear gas. I never fully grasped it until I grew up a little more and learned more about the actual history, because just like in America, prior to the revolution, that history was not the correct one. So in a good, I would say, silver lining, Venezuela was able to gain back some of its true history. As you can see, due to the revolution, the situation in Venezuela got pretty bad. So how bad is Venezuela's collapse? As you can see in the figure here, 63% is the Venezuela crisis. So we are right there next to Syria. It's very, very discouraging to experience something that could have very easily been prevented. Low oil prices, economic mismanagement, and political uncertainty have plunged Venezuela into an economic tailspin virtually unknown among countries during peacetime. By the end of this year, Venezuela's economy will have shrunk by 63% since the current political crisis erupted in 2016. It actually started back in 2010. Here's how the drop compares with other notable economic collapses over the past century. I do want to point out that the second figure, one of the most disheartening things about what's happened to my country, a total of 5.4 million people have left since 2014. Most of us go to South American countries like Argentina, Peru, and others. And believe it or not, we face the same kind of discrimination. It's a little bit different. It's more of a nationalism that they portray. So there's a whole lot of another story that comes with that. Next, we will discuss court cases leading to the development of affirmative action in the United States. John F. Kennedy's Executive Order 10925. A mandate occurred during the 1960s when individual colleges and universities began to institute affirmative action programs to address the remnants of slavery and Jim Crow, which constricted the access of Black students to historically white institutions. John F. Kennedy, under the Executive Order 10925, made the first known reference to affirmative action, which mandated that government contractors were required to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. It took various executive orders in the 1960s that dealt with affirmative action in the workforce before higher education institutions began adopting the practice. On the picture that you see on the right, John F. Kennedy's Executive Order 10925 used affirmative action for the first time by instructing federal contractors to make affirmative action to ensure that applicants are treated equally without regard to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Establish the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. This is by far one of the most difficult pills for me to swallow, knowing that I am being discriminated against on. I have my bachelor's in communications and I was doing collections for a long time because I am a non-traditional student. It killed me. Sucked the soul out of me. So I decided one day after I had a panic attack and I was doing a graduate assistantship and taking 3 graduate courses that I just needed to sleep for 18 days. Or I'm sorry, 18 hours. Because I didn't call in, I lost my job, didn't get unemployment. So I'm like, okay, I have my bachelor's degree in communications with an intercultural communication minor and a GPA of 3.66. And I have an internship and a graduate assistantship, and I have done customer service, collections, banking, all kinds of stuff, all of my young adult life. How come I have applied to over 60 positions and not one has hired me? And how come I applied for 2 equity positions at St. Cloud State and then a white person was hired? When that happened to me, because I know that if I would just to be like customer service, collections, maid, I would get a job instantly. But with what I have worked so far to not get at least a call back or anything, it's a really hard pill to swallow for me. So now we get to the hilarious other side of the coin, which is the critics of affirmative action, which are a lot of people that think just like this. So we have come across the Bakke decision. This case was brought on by Alan Bakke, who was rejected twice by the U.S. Davis Medical School. And, this case was pretty significant. Bakke sued the school for discrimination based on his race. He was white, deeming that their decision was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. While the Supreme Court negated racial quotas in higher education admissions, it justified the use of race as an additional factor in college admissions. So Justice Lewis F. Powell Jr. maintained that pursuing a diversified student body was the lawful goal for institutions of higher learning. So the Powell Compromise stemmed from this decision. Now, all of this happened and it's still not mandated. I did retrieve this information from Rhodes. So now if we point here to our left, we can clearly see this hilarious comic. We have Bakke here just hanging out at home, 1978. So after my experience in Vietnam, I want to do something to save lives. I'm going to become a doctor. So Davis Medical School states, we are starting an affirmative action program. We will set aside 16 out of 100 positions for minorities. But my grades are higher than the minorities you admitted. I'm sorry, we cannot accept you into medical school because the white quota has been filled. So to himself, he thinks, this is discrimination and unfair. I am going to court. So I believe that Alan Bakke was the original Karen. Just to stem from all of the stuff that goes on, and not much has changed since 1978. As a repercussion of the Bakke decision, institutions across the country were still able to use race as an additional or plus factor when making decisions regarding admissions, while still prohibiting the using of quotas. Calling 1998. Many higher education institutions interpreted the Bakke decision as a mandate for institutionalizing race-conscious admissions policies to promote campus, racial, and ethnic diversity as a compelling interest. The Bakke decision effectively justified their respective race-conscious practices and facilitated the creation of additional programs targeting the recruitment and support of underrepresented students of color. Accordingly, large numbers of post-secondary institutions instituted or modified affirmative action practices in the areas of admissions, processes, retention efforts, and scholarship programs. Bowen and Bach, 1998. Howard 1997 and Colling 1998 from the Rhodes article. If it wasn't for the protests that went on during this case and the amount of noise that these protesters made, I don't think that this case would have gone the same way that it did. A lot of people discourage protest, but it is necessary to make change. Yet even while affirmative action enjoyed a degree of prosperity and support across many sectors, conservative forces opposed to affirmative action were growing in size and strength. This does shed a light on the far-right neoliberal beliefs and values that some Americans hold. These views are deep-rooted in hatred of those they fear, because some white Americans feel so entitled that they will push their oppression on others to another limit. Now we will move on to the evolution of affirmative action. When affirmative action becomes a part of the way in which a post-colonial state builds national identity, it frequently is institutionalized in the newly formed nation's constitution or related legislation. This practice was common in the 1950s through the 1970s. In other countries, affirmative action develops when there is a collective mobilization around group rights, alongside global discourse around anti-racism and non-discrimination. In many of these cases, there is a history of oppression or discrimination against an indigenous, racial, or ethnic or religious group. I would like to point out the figure on the left. Oppression is the denial of access to material resources and social power. Oppression can be covert or overt. It is important to be able to identify and name the types of oppression to be able to transcend them. Oppression can manifest in four distinct ways. These are the forms of oppression. Individual oppression. An individual's active or passive participation in oppression can take the form of conscious or unconscious belief, leads to stereotypes, bias, and prejudice. Interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is the action that accompanies stereotypes and prejudice in group interactions, leads to unequal treatment of people in different identity groups or of discrimination. I have dealt with this several times. Systemic oppression is found in institutional structures that are designed to privilege some and oppress others, results in equity, which is what we're dealing here now in America. Cultural oppression. Cultural oppression is found in norms that impose a sense of inferiority or superiority. For example, a group can be thought of as inferior if they do not speak or use proper grammatical English. I retrieve this from the Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives from Michigan State University. I want to point out that I came here when I was 9 years old, so English is not my first language, but I did learn it when I was 9, and I don't have that thick of an accent. I talked on the phone all of my early adult life as customer service agent or in collections, and there has been so many times where a person who most of the time did not even speak English as well as I did would just go off on me as soon as they heard my name or as soon as they heard the slightest accent. It's very, I don't understand why people do that. For example, when somebody comes to my country, the first thing we want to do, especially if they're American, is get to know them and make them feel like welcome and at home, feed them, want to get to know their language and know more about them. I wish we would get the same treatment here. I do have some amazing friends and support group in Minnesota that I honestly feel like Minnesota has some of a collective force and is a little bit more open-minded, while there still are some major issues that we have to deal with, especially in St. Cloud. So yes, I've been living here all this time and I still haven't been able to get used to that, but I try. So it is important to note that there is considerable variation among universities within specific national contexts that have adopted institutionally driven affirmative action models. For example, higher education institutions such as community colleges in the United States are not selective in admissions and hence do not practice affirmative action. In addition, some states in the U.S. have passed statewide referenda that ban affirmative action in any university that receives state funding, which includes all state universities. Like I had mentioned before, affirmative action does shift over time within national contexts as well. Regime changes, demographic shifts, and instability influence how affirmative action is maintained or restructured. Now we can move on to the impact on practice. Rhodes et al., 2005, argue that affirmative action has self-identified itself as a social construction linked to recurrent patterns of activity, armored with the backing of supporters and critics. They contest that while the majority thinks affirmative action policies emerged from the civil rights movement of the 1960s, throughout periods of history, it evolved into a movement. Rhodes backs up his argument by noting Ralph Turner's 1994 work, proposing that affirmative action can be defined as a specific movement, working within the conditions of a general social movement, like the civil rights movement. In order to forge ahead, pro-affirmative policies, social movement analysis can be utilized to provide cognizance of the state and measures needed to continuously develop its position. Undoubtedly, there is no more telling evidence of the role of collective action than to look at the resistance that has emerged as a part of a collective effort to end affirmative action. And he retrieved that from the work that Chavez, 1998, Pusser, 2004, Stefancic, and Delgado, 1996. In higher education institutions, affirmative action should be monitored by human resources, and all learning centers should implement an Office for Institutional Equity and Access, like the department found at St. Cloud State University. This office is responsible for producing and updating their institution's yearly affirmative action plan and ensuring staff and students are aware of the school's commitment to its policies. The plan outlines the school's actions towards affirmative action, individuals responsible for directing, implementing the policies in the plan, and other helpful information. Rhodes also points out that another milestone to advance affirmative action would be to utilize the findings of theories under social movement analysis. In intellectual associations, such as the Association for the Study of Higher Education and the American Educational Research Association, organizational theories and perspectives tend to guide empirical work conducted on higher education reform. As mentioned in the work by Clark, 1998, Peterson, 1985, 1989, Turney, 1988, 1993, 1999. Other substructures that can be utilized in reform analysis include theories of the state, Carnoy, 1994, Carnoy, 11, 1998, and Slaughter, 1988. Historical perspectives by Geiger, 1986, 1999, 93. Economic views by Johnstone, 1998, Massey, 1996. And political frameworks by Ordorica, 2003. Pusser, 2003, 2004, Pusser and Ordica, 2001. Hinrichs, 2012, argues that affirmative action bans have no effect on archetypical scholars and institutions, yet they reduce enrollment of discounted BIPOC students and maximize white student enrollment at particular colleges. By utilizing methodology used by Abdi and Gardizabal, 2003, and Abdi, Diamond, and Heimuller, 2010, Heinrichs found that banning affirmative action at a public university in the top 50 of the U.S. news rankings is associated with a decrease in Black enrollment of roughly 1.74 percentage points, a decrease in Hispanic enrollment by roughly 2.03 percentage points, and a decrease in Native American enrollments by roughly 0.47 percentage points. Henricks, 2012. Moving on, we will discuss the consequences of not following affirmative action. The economic cost of conflict, a case study of the Basque Country. Case study methods of Abadi and Garzabal, 2003, and Abadi, Diamond, and Humer, 2010, find that the affirmative action ban in California shifted underrepresented minority students from more selective campuses to less selective ones at the University of California. As you can see on the figure on the right here, it does state the methods of affirmative action bans in the U.S. In Oklahoma, legislatively referred constitutional amendment. New Hampshire, statute. Arizona, initiative, constitutional amendment. Colorado, failed initiative, constitutional amendment. Nebraska, initiative, constitutional amendment. Michigan, initiative, constitutional amendment. Florida, executive order by governor. Wow, Florida. Washington, initiative, statute. California, initiative, constitutional amendment. And people always wonder why stuff never gets done around the Capitol. I interned at the Capitol for Capital Pathways program, and I saw exactly what it's like. And you know, some bills still have not been passed because of this. I don't know what's going on with that, but maybe just like some fresh faces, some more progressive thoughts, someone that's not like totally to the right, totally to the left might help out in some of these cases. But you know, until we get hired, how can we make a change? Now we move on to responding to critics by Tim Weiss, Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White, Taylor and Francis Group, 2005. There are 5 principal arguments in opposition to affirmative action in colleges and universities. Number 1, efforts amount to reverse discrimination and bump whites from slots in schools that they would otherwise obtain and to which they are rightly entitled. Number 2, affirmative action requires colleges to lower their admission standards and admit students of color who are less qualified than whites and who are then unable to keep up with the work at colleges that are ultimately too difficult for them. Number 3, preferences result in stigma and a loss of self-esteem for those who benefit from them, causing them to doubt their own abilities. Number 4, affirmative action is not needed as evidence by the way in which Asian Pacific Americans have succeeded in this country. And last but not least, the 5th reason. The reason for Black underachievement is not discrimination or any form of injustice that requires affirmative action as a response, but rather persistent cultural defects within the Black community itself, including an inadequate attachment to education as its life goal. If you know anything about history and structural demographic theory, you would understand that the reason why African Americans are in the state that they are in is because they were completely ripped away from their culture and put into projects and ghettos by design, where there are literally liquor stores and pawn shops and all kinds of things that, you know, it's not there by design. In Utah, there was a very, very well-off community. If you were aware, I don't know if you are, but I am happy to inform you about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And this is what I'm getting from Wikipedia, that took place on May 31st and June 1st, 1991, when mobs of white residents, some of whom had been deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked Black residents and destroyed homes and businesses in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, U.S., alternatively known for the Tulsa Pogrom, the Tulsa Race Riot, or the Black Wall Street Massacre. The event is considered one of the single most worst incidents of racial violence in American history. The attackers burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood, at the time one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, known as Black Wall Street. And do you see? So they get mad because they don't want to overcome their obstacles, but when they do, they burn their towns to the ground. So, and this just happened in like 1991. It wasn't even that long ago. But, they say, oh, slavery, that happened like ages ago, which is not even true. There was like slaves up in some places up until that point. According to the available data, almost 9 in 10 faculty members in the United States are white. Less than 6% are Black. Less than 4% are Asian. Less than 2% are Latino or Latina. And 0.2% are American Indian. When we look only at full professors as opposed to part-time instructors and associate professors, only 3% of tenured faculty members are Black in the United States. Pierce, 2012. As you can see in the figure on your left, it clearly backs up my statement. Throughout the U.S., public school teachers are more likely to be white than their students are. Percentage point difference in white teachers and students based on the 2017-2018 school year. I just want to quickly point out a couple things from the previous slide. I read an article, can't remember what the name is, just popped into my head a while back, about how students in a collective force didn't really specify race, but how hard it is nowadays to go and get your master's, your PhD, to become a professor. A lot of times you're placed as a teacher's aide or doing research for years, and it's really difficult to find and land a job as a professor in this market. So imagine what it's like for students of color to have, to go through that with the collective force, being oppressed and discriminated against as we are. Another thing that I want to point out is African Americans. In my intercultural communication minor, when I was getting that, I learned that about 4 million slaves were brought over to South America by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and only about 800,000 were brought to the United States. The only difference is that the Spaniards, the Catholics, believed that the slaves had a soul, which is totally messed up to, hey, you're a slave, but you have a soul, but it just follow me quick. But then the Pilgrims of the United States did not believe that African Americans had a soul. So in our cultures, they were able to integrate more of their Western African culture and beliefs. That's how Santeria came about. That's how salsa, merengue, bachata, like all of this, that's how Latinos came about. But in America, they were completely wiped, like they could not practice anything. It was just like just like how it happened with the Native Americans, they were placed in these boarding schools to forget their language, have their hair cut off, go through all of this stuff, and to completely have amnesia about their culture and who they are. But yet we still pass judgment on them for the way that they act. That just is absurd to me. So continuing on. As Lydia Chavez finds in her book, The Color Bind, California's battle to end affirmative action, conservative groups poured money into the campaign to support the California Civil Rights Initiative. The California Republican Party raised nearly $1 million. The Republican National Party donors provided another $1 million, and state Republicans paid for many expensive and deceptive television commercials. Pierce, 2012. Why though? Why would you go through all of that to then pass judgment saying that what's going on with them is all on them, and then have the courage to say, hey, we're not racist, right? Makes no sense. So now we can go into how my view on the act was transformed and significant takeaways. How my view on the act was transformed from new findings. Affirmative action is crucial for protecting our democracy. Diversity is essential in a global economy. Critics of affirmative action have proven to have little to no basis in their arguments. The Association for the Study of Higher Education and the American Educational Research Association are great sources for pragmatic work. And some significant takeaways. The origin of affirmative action. That was so great. I love learning about that because I had no idea from the backstory of the backstory and how it all started due to colonialism. Then the evolution of the act, which, I agree we could be 10,000 years ahead from where we are, but here we are. Group basis mobilization and anti-racism, that is something that we seriously need to talk about. I know people say, oh, when you talk about racism, that's what makes the problem. No, when you don't talk about racism, that's the problem. The relevance to inequality in Venezuela, how at the beginning it was that super rich, more white people that were getting all the stuff, and then the people in Venezuela were like, no way, we're gonna have a revolution. To the unfortunate acts that happened that followed from the poor management of the country to complete corruption. And the perseverance of activists against affirmative action state bans. That is very important. Mobilizations and people that go and fight, like nowhere in your life will you ever get anything done, especially as a person of color, unless you fight tooth and nail for it. For example, I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, depression, anxiety, and it was about 2 months ago when I was diagnosed with this. Yet my friend was also diagnosed around the same time through Centracare. She went to her primary care provider who prescribed her the medicine that she needed. I tried to do the same. I haven't been able to get it. They have no one available for me. She got it through her PCP. I have to jump all these hoops just so I can get medication. And it's she has a pretty good life, and it's very disheartening. And I just want to leave on one last takeaway here. This is The Ages of Discord by Peter Turchin, a structural demographic analysis of American history. I'm just going to read the back here for you. We are on the wrong track. 70% of Americans, and counting, think so. The real wage of a U.S. worker today is less than it was 40 years ago, but there are 4 times as many multimillionaires. As inequality grows, the politics become more poisonous. Every year, more and more Americans go on shooting sprees, killing strangers and passerbys, and now, increasingly, representatives of the state. Troubling trends of this kind are endlessly discussed by public intellectuals and social scientists, but mostly, they talk about only a small slice of the overall problem. After all, how on earth can another murderous rampage have anything to do with polarization in Congress? And is there really a connection between too many multimillionaires and government gridlock? Historical analysis shows that long spells of equitable prosperity and internal peace are succeeded by protracted periods of inequity, increasing misery, and political instability. These crisis periods, ages of discord, have recurred in societies throughout history. Modern Americans may be disconcerted to learn that the U.S. right now has much in common with the antebellum 1850s, and more surprisingly, with the ancient regime France on the eve of the French Revolution. Can it really be true that there's nothing new about our troubled time and that similar ages arise periodically for similar underlying reasons? Ages of Discord marshals structural demographic theory and detailed historical data to show that this is indeed the case. The book takes the reader on a roller coaster ride through American history, from the era of the good feelings of the 1820s to our first age of discord, which culminated in the American Civil War, to post-World War II, prosperity, and finally to our present, second age of discord. Just wanted to leave you with that last thought because to me it is very crucial that we understand this in order to move forward. Because if we don't know about this, how are we supposed to make any type of change? So I hope you did take away something from this, and here are my sources if you would like to see them. And thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.